Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University here on the Heart.org and Medscape Cardiology. Over the course of almost 9 years now, I've been actively using Twitter as a means to communicate with the broader cardiovascular community. Sometimes I communicate about research that either my group is involved with or that I find interesting in the literature. Sometimes I just communicate more broadly about things related to heart health. I've really tried to keep my persona in the area of cardiovascular health and medicine. But certainly I use it as an opportunity to follow a lot of other things that I'm interested in. Increasingly over the past few years, many colleagues from cardiology have joined Twitter, and I think that CardioTwitter, or hashtag CardioTwitter, has really gotten a robust following online. Things like Radial First have really promoted the use of radial access site in cardiac cath and intervention. And anytime a major trial comes out, we see a lot of interest in the community about sharing their thoughts and perspectives via Twitter. I was particularly interested a month or two ago. My friend and colleague Bobby Ye from Boston published a paper on academic cardiology and social media that I found a really interesting read, and I've asked Bobby to join us today to talk to our listeners and readers on theheart.org about how he thinks about the use of social media in cardiology, what he's gained from it, maybe some of the things he struggles with, some of the opportunities he sees. I think we'll have a good, broad-ranging conversation. So again, today my guest is Dr. Bobby Ye. Bobby is an associate professor of medicine in interventional cardiology at Harvard Medical School. He is the director of the Richard and Susan Smith Center for Outcomes Research in Cardiology at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. Bobby, thanks for joining us here on Medscape Cardiology.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
So, Bobby, you heard in my introduction sort of opening the door to have this conversation about the use of social media in academic cardiology, and I really did enjoy reading your paper. I thought you hit some key issues about democratization, peer review, how does one debate and dissent in this environment, and then bringing us back around very, I think, aptly for today, issues about how do you determine digital truth. So let's get started with maybe the personal reflection. How did you get involved in Twitter, and how do you use it as part of your professional persona?
It's an interesting question, Bob. I joined Twitter really a long time ago, actually, probably soon after it was formed in the late 2000s when I was a cardiology fellow. And at that time, there was very little content on Twitter, certainly not much in cardiology. And as a group of us in cardiology fellowship decided to join Twitter as a means of being able to essentially do group texting with one another. I don't think you could group text at that time. We all sort of were new to the sort of cell phone and smartphone use. I think it was the generation of first iPhones. And we were at the American College of Cardiology and thought it would be a great way to be able to tell each other which rooms we were in and what were the great talks going on at the time. So that's how I originally signed up for Twitter.
That's a great story.
And then it's sort of funny because we used it only partially successfully at that meeting. And thereafter, it sort of lay dormant for me as I didn't even have a picture. I think I was the proverbial egg. That picture was there, didn't have a photo, had no description. And it probably sat there idly for 7 or 8 years. And it wasn't, I think, until maybe 2014, 2015, that I started reading people like you and others who were active early in cardiology and Twitter. I think when the journals started to have Twitter accounts, it became very real to me that this was a great way to not only decipher content, to have content filtered toward me that was relevant to what I wanted to learn, but also have interpretation from experts like yourself and others who were really participating and starting to grow this new entity. Before it was limited to sort of e-table of contents that I was receiving from an increasing number of journals over time. And that became more and more unwieldy. So the fact that this content was being filtered in a way, I think it was really practical in a way. It helped me read literature that I was interested in. So that's initially how I used it. Since then, of course, it's really evolved into something bigger than that.
It's interesting. I also started shortly after Twitter became available. I checked today before we had this discussion. I joined in 2009. And I remember I joined as a way to communicate what was going on and keep up at medical meetings. And for the first couple of years I was on there, that was my shtick, if you will. I tweeted during medical meetings, and I would be busy during the medical meetings. I would have fun throwing out comments and observations from different things that were being presented or people's talks that I had just heard or were starting to hear. I really kept my presence to the medical meetings, and people would joke. They say, well, Bob, we know where you are at least. You're at the ACC or at the AHA or you're at the TCT, because that's when I would be very active on Twitter. Like you, several years ago, I started increasingly incorporating it into my broader professional activities and have really learned a lot from that. Let's talk about what you've learned from this, because you've become very active. And I have to say, your Cheetos tweetorial is one that really caught my attention, because you've used it as a format to help educate the community as well. Talk to the audience a bit about how you're using it.
Yeah, certainly, as you're alluding to, education is one of the great ways I think that Twitter can be used. And certainly all of us in academic cardiology spend so much of our time teaching. We teach on the wards. We're associated with medical schools, and we teach at the medical school. But what it's enabled is this incredible reach. And the same content that one uses in PowerPoint slides in their lectures that you give to an audience of 10, you can actually disseminate to an audience of tens of thousands over Twitter, and that's been a real revelation for me. As you know, clinical research methods is something that I have a particular passion for and interest in. Certainly our group has that too. And sometimes when we have particular methods that we're interested in applying to certain things, or we see things that maybe could have been done differently in a paper here or there that's being talked about, it's been a great opportunity to sort of string a few tweets together that can teach a subject matter that maybe not that accessible to that many people. Certainly in the community, if you're outside the educational environment of a school, maybe you don't get that resource handed to you on a daily basis. And we found that there's really an incredible reach associated with that.
When you've talked about methods, one of the things I've been impressed with is you put it in a very, I would say, friendly set of language. Did Twitter teach you to do that, or did you naturally teach that way in your classes or in your lectures with fellows, for example, back at the BI?
I've always tried to do that in the lectures I give. I teach at the School of Public Health here, and then we also have a didactic methods course that we run out of the BI. I always tried to do that, but I will say that Twitter has made that more essential. When we've had coursework, you have an audience of people who are already have a certain basis in that subject matter, who are engaged. But Twitter, you're reaching out to people who might not even know that this is relevant to them. And so I think in the shortened amount of characters that you have to work with, as well as the limited attention span of your audience, and the fact that you may be teaching something to somebody who may not initially be receptive, that catchiness and pithiness of it really has become an essential element. It's actually improved my ability to teach outside of Twitter. I now know that, wow, you get sort of instantaneous feedback. This is really has so much traction to it. For example, the Cheetos tweet, which you're talking about, which was about immortal time bias, which is such an esoteric idea, but when you put it in plain language, it becomes so clear. That was actually an aha moment for me when I first sent that out, sitting back and thinking about, what's some ludicrous example that could really illustrate this concept that everybody would get, and I sort of threw that out there. And the amount of traction that got really was enlightening for me that this is really an effective way to teach, both inside and outside of Twitter.
I agree with you, and I think I emailed you or texted you or something when I saw that Cheetos tweetorial, because it really captured my imagination for how one might think about teaching. And it makes me reflect on our mutual colleague, Mike Gibson, who might be the most active cardiologist on Twitter. And what Mike does so well is combine the pithiness with some really interesting insights into cardiovascular medicine. And I see more and more people doing that, which I do think is a friendlier way to teach. To your earlier comment, it's made me really rethink some of my presentations. I find myself now in presentations using more pictures, a single graph. Like you, I'm a data nerd, and if I can't tell you something 5 times with 5 different pieces of data, I feel like I haven't done a good job. And I'm starting to learn that maybe that's not the best way to do it.
I've had the same experience. I think along those same lines, our research group has really embraced these concepts of data visualizations, trying to explain a research paper in one slide. With many of our research studies now, we put out simultaneous visual abstracts. And I give a lot of credit to a fellow at the University of Michigan, Andrew Ibrahim, who I think really, if he didn't invent the concept, he certainly was one of the first people who really put it forward in a digestible way for a broad audience. He was a surgical resident. I think he might still be actually a surgery resident who really put forward this idea of visual abstracts, one-slide presentations of papers. And that idea has caught fire at journals, in research groups, and we've tried to follow that. And actually, Twitter has really helped, I think, work in synergy with this idea of single-slide visual representations of studies, working together to help disseminate our new research findings.
Another colleague on Twitter, Frank Harrell, biostatistician at Vanderbilt, who was the chair there for many years. I knew Frank back in the days when he was at the Duke Data Bank for cardiovascular disease, and he's a big proponent, as you know, of data visualization. And what Frank does beautifully, in addition to providing you visuals, he's a pretty tough peer reviewer out there on Twitter, isn't he?
Yes, he sure is.
But what I love about his tweets is that he then refers you to his blog frequently or to somebody else's writings where they dissect the method that I think has caused me more than once to change a perspective on something. Say, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. That's an interesting piece of information. So that gets into two things that you bring up in your paper that I'd like to talk about. And one, by mentioning the surgical resonance. Let's do this one first. You called it the democratization of voices, which I thought really captures it. Talk to the audience about what you meant by that and what you're seeing on Twitter that's contributing to a healthy discussion in academic cardiology.
It's a concept that certainly many people have raised about Twitter, and in particular about how Twitter and cardiology can interact. And it's that everybody has effectively an equal voice on Twitter. You can ask a question of anyone, and anyone can ask a question of you. You put that in contrast with what might happen at a major academic society meeting where there's a panel, there's a clear hierarchy, there's a speaker, there's a panel that's raised on a podium. They are often these sort of luminaries of the field. And then there's an audience that is set quite literally beneath those on the panel. There may be a microphone or two set out in the audience, but boy, I can tell you, you may not have felt that way for a long time now, but I can tell you that that's really intimidating to try to get up there and stand at that microphone and ask a question to such an august group on stage when you're surrounded by that many, could be 1,000 people in the audience. And Twitter takes away that barrier to being able to ask a question. It's so easy to ask a question to luminaries in the field. And that, I think, has really promoted good conversation because at every level, whether or not you are a first-year medical student or just interested in it, you're a patient, or you're somebody who is the father of a field, I think everybody has good questions, and it's really raised a sort of level of dialogue that can happen there. I think one simple example that I've been thinking about a lot is one of the ways I think we establish hierarchies just socially is how we address each other in titles. I probably wouldn't go to Dr. Braunwald and call him by his first name, but I think he would certainly feel comfortable addressing me by mine. But on Twitter, everybody's the same. It removes the very first way that we establish hierarchy and how we interact, and that's how we address each other. We all address each other the same way on Twitter, and I think that's just one example of how, and then everything else that follows from it, how it really gives everybody an equal voice and allows equal participation.
I've had some great conversations with people over Twitter who then I meet at their institution or at some medical meeting, and it does change the dynamic, doesn't it? One young woman who's a cardiology fellow who I met down at Texas Heart, and I met her first on Twitter. Her name is Brianna Costello, and she's a fantastic voice out on Twitter, but I developed this interaction with her over Twitter that has been really helpful. And then when I went to visit Texas Heart, it was fun to see her live face-to-face and then to continue to engage in that conversation. I do agree with you. It's opened up my eyes to a lot of different ways to engage with the broader community. And, Bobby, I wonder if you think that this is true. Another observation I had, particularly at this year's recent ACC meeting, where the organizers really tried to remove some of those barriers to participation by having much more moderated on the iPad questions so that people didn't have to get up to the mic. So doing more stuff out on the exhibit floor where there was no stage, where you were standing facing people and having a conversation, to do things in a much more conversational way. I had a couple presentations at ACC that I was part of a panel in one of the lounges, the Women in Cardiology Lounge or the FIT Lounge. Do you think that's part of the whole trend of trying to get more voices into the conversation?
I think so. I had the same observation, and increasingly those types of strategies to decrease the amount of separation between who's supposed to be speaking and who's supposed to be listening has really helped those meetings recently. In particular, there's been that movement in the past year or two. I agree. I'd love to see that continue. I mean, I think that there's even more innovative things that we can do in that space. I'd like to think that Twitter and social media is part of what has fomented that move among the society meetings.
Tell the audience how you use Twitter. Give us a day in the life of Bobby Ye on Twitter.
Yeah, so it's varied. I have to say that this week I'm not using it much.
Let the audience know that you're okay because you just had your third child. Congratulations, by the way.
Thanks. I was debating whether or not I should announce it on Twitter. But I decided that's
well, you did note as an aside that I announced that we're opening up a job at Stanford via Twitter. I think that was much better than placing an ad in the New England Journal or something.
Things that I think we want to reach a broader audience are great for Twitter. So I use Twitter both as a content, I would say, producer, disseminator, and also as a consumer of content. And it really started out primarily as a consumer of content. I use Twitter, as I mentioned, as a great resource to parse through the overwhelming amount of information and literature that I think practicing interventional cardiologists or practicing academic cardiologists should know. And what Twitter helps me do is parse down that content. I can see what other people are talking about and participate in that conversation. And then when I want to, link through to the primary content because those are available. So it's an entree into diving more deeply into content. The second way is to, as active investigators, I think many of us use it to disseminate our research. And as I've mentioned, we do that in the form of links to articles that we've just published, visual abstracts. In the beginning, I will say that there was sort of a discomfort with that. I'll admit to saying, like, gee, this feels very self-promotional. If I say, hey, we just published this study. And I've gotten over that a bit. And I will say that we publish research and we do research in order to disseminate it. And so to the extent that it's a vehicle for helping us get our message out for what we think is important, I've become less embarrassed about doing that. And that's taken some time to overcome, truthfully. Finally, it's a great way to converse and to meet new people and to learn new things. Like, I can't tell you how many, as a practicing interventional cardiologist, I can count at least 5 things that I do differently now in the cath lab that I learned on Twitter. And that might seem funny to non-proceduralists, but they're just little tips and tricks that are actually, I think, the best vehicle to disseminate quickly new techniques that would never undergo a peer review process because you do a small change in how you sort of set up a table or something like that. But it's been really fantastic for that.
I call myself a reformed interventionalist, as somebody who practiced interventional cardiology for a long time but no longer does. I've really enjoyed following the interventional community to continue to stay current just from my own observations of, what's new in the cath lab today? So I agree with you. There's these little tricks, and the whole movement of Radio First, I think, has been a fantastic example of how one can use Twitter to promote techniques, technologies, as you say, little tips. Bobby, 2 things that you said really struck me, one of which is you're scanning the literature doing this. And when I tell some of my colleagues, this is how I scan the literature now. I used to get my journals and go through them, and then I used to just look at the email table of contacts. Now I follow a bunch of journals that interest me, including journals that I previously hadn't read. But now I do because it's easy on Twitter. It's a fantastic way, I find, to keep up with the literature because you can constantly search the New England Journal and JAMA, Circulation, JACC, European Heart Journal, and then I can also start getting into Nature, Cell, Science. Is that what you're doing? Are you using Twitter to search the literature?
I am. I follow most of the major journals and then new ones, as you say. And then the other thing that really helps me is crowdsourcing my literature searches. There are a wealth of individuals out there who read more broadly than I do. I mean, I think that collectively, certainly, the collective reads more broadly than any individual. And if there's something that's really interesting in the economic space, there's something really interesting in the social sciences space that's relevant, sometimes that ends up showing up on my feed. To be able to digest that in a way and then really dive in there and see how it applies to what I'm doing has been really eye-opening. I often forward these papers to my mentees or a research group, and I say, look at how they applied this interesting method in a question that is totally unrelated to cardiology at all, but is incredibly relevant to what we do, what we might ask in cardiology. That's been a really terrific part of joining Twitter. And I would never see that if I limited my reading to what I got in the mail or what I received in email even. Part of that is choosing people to follow who, as a group, are really engaged in or interested in a diverse set of topics.
I'll endorse that approach as well. I follow a group of people that I consider to have great taste in science for that reason. They've broadened my horizon, and as you say, they're not people necessarily who are in medicine or healthcare, but they have some really interesting views on science. They follow and digest a great deal of literature, and I do the same thing, Bobby. I pull PDFs off of Twitter and put them in my to-read folder. I read them right there on my iPhone if I have time. To me, it's really opened my eyes to other areas of research that might be quite useful, even though on the surface you'd think, well, geez, isn't that a little tangential to what you do? Well, not if you get into the methods. Maybe it's very apt for what we do. Bobby, two topics I want to do in closing, and I think they're related. You brought up one in your paper called digital truth, and there's certainly been a lot in a very serious way said in society today about how do you know what's true out there on the internet, and how do you know what's true as we begin to digest it? Crowdsourcing is certainly one way, but I think you also captured it in your title when you called it both the wisdom and the madness of the crowd, and some have called it at times the tyranny of the crowd. And that brings to the second issue that I'd like you to touch on. So a little bit on truth, and then maybe the whole issue of civility. Clyde Yancey and I have had a couple of these podcasts devoted to the concept of civility in social discourse. And while I'm no stranger to disagreements and arguments, sometimes things in social media can, maybe with the cloak of anonymity, can get a little nasty. You want to talk about those issues, truth and civility?
Yeah, I think really both important issues, and issues that are, I think, common to everybody's experience on Twitter, whether or not you're a cardiologist or just engaged in Twitter for other reasons. The first issue related to what is true, specifically to cardiology, I think what this shows up as is interpretations of research. I mean, certainly we talked about truth in terms of the alternative facts and what's going on in the political discourse, but limiting our discussion to really what's relevant to academic cardiology. There are studies that are released that are highly controversial. There are studies done with different levels of rigor. And then there are interpretations of those studies that have different levels of validity. Sanjay Kaul, who showed me this quote originally from Nietzsche, which was, "There is no truth, only interpretations." And I really love that quote because I think it's highly applicable to Twitter. A trial can come out. A trial is a set of information and facts, but really the interpretation can vary widely. I think Orbita was a great example that I wrote about in the paper, which I think there were multiple interpretations of how that trial should be interpreted. And some of them were, frankly, not accurate. I think that there are shades of gray, and we can agree or disagree on what the final interpretation of a trial like Orbita should be. But certainly there was a lot of misinformation that was spread around that time on both sides. And so how does one, as a consumer of that information, let's say you're not really in that space or you're a patient, how are you supposed to decipher through that and tell what's actually true? It really requires you to go into the original information, the PDFs, like linking through to the PDFs, and really kind of coming up with your own opinion. And I think if one is to rely just on the opinions of who they follow, one could easily be, depending on who they follow and how much of an echo chamber is actually created. We don't know, truthfully, what our sort of Twitter sphere looks like. It could be one huge echo chamber a lot of the time. And if you're not careful, you can easily go down a pathway of believing something to be really true and actually be a little bit wrong about that. And I say that's true about all of us, myself included. I'm sure you feel the same.
No, I definitely do.
Yeah, it's one of the important reasons why I think it's very important to follow people that you disagree with.
Exactly.
I mean, that is one of the real challenges of Twitter, though, is knowing what does my digital sphere look like? What does my Twitter sphere look like relative to the sort of universe of opinions out there? I think for all of us, it is not a representative sphere. So to the extent that we can all challenge ourselves to follow people that we disagree with in a civil way, I think that will only increase the likelihood that we arrive at truth. Which gets you to your second question, which is how should we be disagreeing on Twitter and what's the role of dissent, disagreement, civility? And I agree with you, and I listened to your podcasts and your articles that you wrote with Dr. Yancey with great interest because you and I have had offline exchanges about this. I think we're both of the opinion that, if nothing else, interactions have to be civil. We owe that to one another. We're all there for the same purpose, which is to get out something that's true and not spread falsehoods. And I think that we do that best when we are kind and civil to one another. The anonymity of that interaction, it reminds me, I always use the analogy of road rage, which is there's something about just being one level removed from somebody when you're behind a windshield and another person's behind a windshield and you're in your vehicle. Somehow we just do things and treat people in a way that we would never treat them if we bumped into them in the elevator. I mean, imagine that if you bumped into someone on the way into the elevator and treated them the same way that you treated someone who cut you off on the road, there would be brawls inside an elevator. And on Twitter, I think it's the same way. People are talking to each other in a way often, not everybody. And I'm glad that many have raised, in addition to you and Dr. Yancey, have raised that we ought to be better about this. But many conversations have, I think, degenerated into name-calling and ad hominem attacks to the point where people feel the need to block one another and not engage in that conversation. And that's really a shame. I think blocking is the first sort of window into truly creating your self-created echo chamber. That's one thing that I know you have a lot of opinions on it, and I'd love to hear yours.
I think you've captured a lot of it. Like you, I work at a university, and I always say to our faculty and trainees and staff, look, we're at a university. We ought to be disagreeing with each other, because only through that disagreement and debate will we get to what is a reasonable place to be. But if we're going to disagree with another, let's treat each other respectfully and professionally. Doesn't mean you can't do it with passion and enthusiasm and vigor, but there is a professionalism and a respect attached to that for other people's opinions that I think is critical. And sometimes, as you know well, even in the university community, there can be an increasing intolerance of perspectives that disagree with one's perspective. And so I think we need to guard against that, because we need to be able to have civil discourse and robust professional disagreements that come armed with data, and let's have that conversation. So I'm completely with you. Well, Bobby, this has been a fun conversation. I could keep going, but I want to be respectful of our listeners and their time. I want to thank you, Dr. Bobby Yeh, who is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the director of the Richard and Susan Smith Center for Outcomes Research in Cardiology at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, for joining me here today. Thanks, Bobby. This has been a great review of academic cardiology and social media. And again, congratulations on a very nice paper. And I hope people keep following the two of us on Twitter and engage us in some conversations.
Thanks so much, Bob. It's been a lot of fun.